Many of you are surely wondering why I have summoned you at this hour.
It's time for the big interview.
All right, boys, prepare to be dazzled.
That's right, it's big. It's the big names, the big news, the biggest stories. It's the next big thing. What's the big deal? It's the big interview.
What's going on here? This is big news. We need coverage of this.
Money Life brings you the big thinkers, the top experts, the brightest minds. With the big interview, you can stay informed about all the financial matters that are important to you, all in one big package.
Oh boy, I've never gotten a package this big. I've always wanted to have a huge package.
Did my taxes pay for this?
The big interview. Sit down, strap yourself in, and get ready to learn.
Your mind is beginning to work. It's entirely due to my influence, of course. You mustn't take any credit.
You know, we normally kind of ignore the huge package line that's in that intro, but today maybe not so much, because what we're seeing and what the group actually described was a quote unquote huge disconnect. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the huge disconnect between brokerage ad claims and the tactics that are used when investors wind up having to say, hey, something happened. I was wronged here. Now, if you listen to the show regularly, you know we have talked about it in the past. The whole thing with fiduciary duty. I've given, you know, as the guy who's written several books on choosing and working with financial advisors, I've written countless lines and words on choosing and working with advisors, but also on understanding the fiduciary standard. We expected that things were going to change because the government has been working on it. But last week, we saw PIABA, the Public Investors Arbitration Bar Association, come out with a study that basically said that U.S. brokerage firms are misleading investors about their role as fiduciaries. So we want to make sure you understand that role. So we're talking today with Joe Peiffer. He's president of the Public Investors Arbitration Bar Association. He's also part of Peiffer, Rosca, Wolf, Abdullah, Carr, and Kane in New Orleans. If you want more information, go to PIABA, PIABA.org. Joe Peiffer, welcome to Money Life.
Thank you, Chuck.
So this is an issue that, like I said, we've discussed on the show, but that everybody thought, well, gosh, there's this big push. We're going to wind up seeing it resolved. And the truth is, Wall Street firms, the big brokerage firms, they want you to believe that they're fiduciaries, that they're putting people's best interests first, right up until the moment when they're putting their own interests first, right?
That's exactly correct. They will entice the customers to come in and trust them with their life savings. And then if they do something wrong and they're called to account for it, they will say that we don't have any duties at all to you. We're salesmen. All we have to do is execute trades, and that's it. And you just can't see that in the ads whatsoever.
Yeah, the difference here is between what's called a suitability standard, is something suitable for you, and a fiduciary standard is something in your best interest. And if somebody sells you advice, that counsel has to be in your best interest. If somebody sells you product, it has to be suitable for you. And what happens is they say, well, we'll advise you, but in the end, we're selling you product. How do we get past this? Because the SEC has seemingly sort of given up on the issue. I mean, they were supposed to try to be getting us to where we had a fiduciary standard. It doesn't seem like we're ever going to get there.
Well, it's been a long time in coming, that is for sure. The Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, as your listeners I'm sure know, was passed in July of 2010. We're now almost 5 years later, and no fiduciary standard has been passed. However, I do think we are making some progress. Recently, one of the SEC commissioners, Commissioner White, came out in favor of the fiduciary standard, joining Commissioner Aguilar, and I think we have 2 out of the 5 solidly in the camp that there should be a strong national fiduciary duty for brokerage houses, and I believe that we have a very good shot at getting Commissioner Stein to agree to a fiduciary duty standard as well, as her past statements have said things like the brokers and the customer's interests should be aligned. So I'm very hopeful that we might finally be getting movement on an issue that I know PIABA has been working on for well over a decade.
The PIABA report that you issued last week showed the ad pitches of 9 brokerage firms: Merrill Lynch, Fidelity, Ameriprise, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Allstate, UBS, Berthel Fisher, and Charles Schwab are directly at odds with the different message the firms are sending when it comes to arbitration cases. By the way, at least 5 of those companies are saying they're actually in favor of a fiduciary standard. I have said for a long time that if we get to where we've got a fiduciary standard, it does not mean somebody's not going to wrong you. If you're dealing with a rogue, they don't care about fiduciary standard or not. So explain to my audience what the difference is going to be when it comes to your role. If somebody in my audience feels that they're aggrieved and they go out and they thought they had fiduciary, but they don't, they have suitability, what winds up being the difference in what they have as recourse and how it pays out?
Well, the difference is pretty simple. As a fiduciary, you're like a doctor or a lawyer, and your client's interests have to come first. I've got to put my client's interest in their case ahead of all of my interests. A doctor has to put their patient's interests ahead of their interest in making money. And that is what brokerage firms advertise like. Instead of just a suitability standard, which is different, it's just, is this kind of good enough for the customer? So oftentimes when I see a client and they come into my office, they are absolutely floored by the idea that their broker does not have to put their interest in living a long and happy retirement ahead of the broker's interest in making commissions. And when it comes down to my role in that, it's an awful lot easier to prove a case when you have the highest duty or a fiduciary duty to your client rather than just the duty of a salesman.
There are going to be those who hear me talking to the president of PIABA, the Public Investors Arbitration Bar Association, and say, conflict of interest, look who's doing the study. It's a bar group that wants to see more people potentially going to court. How do you explain that one away so that folks maybe are a little more confident in this case?
Sure. I'll tell you how I explain that away. The I in PIABA is for investors, and the second that we're not in favor of investors, and we're just a lawyer group, then we can pack it up. But we are investor advocates, and it's not for my own practice that I want a fiduciary duty. It's for my dad. It's for my mother. It's for my uncle, who was a pipe fitter at Exxon and is going to have to roll his money out of the Exxon retirement plan and into some brokerage firm. And he is one hell of a guy. And if I wanted to build an oil refinery, I'd call him. But he doesn't know anything about a portfolio. And it's not to say you can't get good advice from good advisors without a fiduciary duty. It's just that you can't. It's just that the advisors don't have to. And everyone should be entitled to unconflicted advice. Okay.
Let me briefly sort of talk about one case, and I don't want to get too hung up here. But, for example, in the PIABA report,
yes,
you guys cited, I'll use UBS, okay?
Yep.
And the advertisement says, until my client knows she comes first, until I understand what drives her and what slows her down, until et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until then we will not rest. That's the basics. And it's all about, I'm going to get to know you. I'm going to do the right things for you.
Yep.
Okay. Now, here's the question. If they are using that as advertising and somebody out there is not swayed by that advertising, never sees that advertising, goes to UBS and is thinking that they've got it, how much of this you got to see what they're doing when we think they're kind of, their public face is not the same as what they do in private? Is any of that itself part of the problem?
Yes, I think it is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that when they're presenting to the public an image of a caring broker that's going to take care of them, just like you would expect your financial advisor to do. After all, most of the people that I run into that are investors have put, they have one big lump sum of money, and that's really their 401k. And so they put their entire nest egg with a guy. Of course they trust him. And of course they should be held to that standard. But when you get into a dispute with them, they litigate like they've got the duties of a used car salesman, and it's a problem.
We're almost out of time here, but is the moral of this story, don't go to anybody who's not a fiduciary, or is it really, no, make sure you understand what the role is? We're not saying just because you're a broker, you're dirty, but make sure that you understand what you're getting into and decide if you're willing to settle for that lesser standard.
I agree completely. I think that you should not, my client should not be afraid to ask me about fees, and investors should not be afraid to ask their brokers whether they believe they have a fiduciary duty to put their client's interests first, number one, and number two, to undertake the time and ask in writing how the broker or financial advisor is getting paid. And that'll tell you a lot about what kind of conflicted or unconflicted advice you're getting.
Well, Joe, it's great stuff. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about it. It is an issue that I consider important. That's why I've written about it so much. And why I'll write about it again, I hope we get a chance to chat with you again as well, Joe.
Thanks, Chuck.
Remember, if you want more information, piaba.org. Joe Peiffer is president of the Public Investors Arbitration Bar Association. He's also with Peiffer, Rosca, Wolf, Abdullah, Carr, and Kane in New Orleans. If you want to learn more about the firm, we've got links to that on our recent and upcoming guest page, and the firm's on Twitter at Prack Law Firm. All right, we have hit the halfway pole on the Tuesday edition of Money Life. Up next, Greg McBride from Bankrate.com, and then Lee Cronzen from the Gator Opportunities Fund in for the Money Life market call as Money Life rolls on right after this message.